Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anna Crow. I'm the Assistant Director of the International Human Rights Clinic. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Victor Madrigal-Borloz, who is the UN Independent Expert on Protection Against Violence and Discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. We're very lucky to have Mr. Madrigal-Borloz here in residence at Harvard Law School in the Human Rights Program as the Eleanor Roosevelt Senior Visiting Researcher. For today, Victor is going to be previewing for you the findings of a report that he'll be presenting to the UN General Assembly very soon on social inclusion for LGBT individuals. Without further ado, please welcome Victor Madrigal-Borloz. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anna. Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be here. It's always a great honor, and I'm very thankful to the colleagues at the Human Rights Program for the wonderful welcome that they've given me here. It was over 20 years since I had been in an academic setting. I've been more in practice, and therefore I'm very grateful that they have been very generous and they have treated me with a lot of compassion. So thanks to all of you. It's very nice to be here. As Anna mentioned, I will be presenting my report to the General Assembly this next Thursday. And so we thought that it could be an opportunity to tell you a little bit what the report is about and to try and get also from you a little bit of an understanding of how some of the messages resonate. So in a way it's a preview, but it's also a way to understand how the messages are sounding and how they resonate. Now, of course, at the UN's third committee, one only gets 7 minutes. And then there is a dedicated 50-so minutes for dialogue with the states. So I will not be as brief at this moment, but I promise that I'll try to be as concise as possible. It's very nice for me that the presentation of the report comes today. Today is the International Day where we are actually thinking about the eradication of poverty. And of course, poverty is created in a multifaceted way by a compounding of factors that actually are reflective of exclusion and discrimination very much. And therefore, very much when I do a report on social inclusion, what I'm actually also referring to is to those factors that actually are excluding persons from the social fabric, perhaps creating a rupture with services provided by the state, and creating situations of systemic discrimination. This year, the Day to Eradicate Poverty is dedicated to placing particular focus on children. And the idea, the motto of the day is to empower children, their families, and their communities to face and eradicate poverty. And I was very much stricken throughout my fact-finding process in my report by how LGBTI children are actually affected in a completely disproportionate way by poverty. One of the findings that was surprising and was leading to many of my work in trying to understand these factors is that where data exists, as many as 40 to 50% of homeless youth identify as LGBT, which gives you an idea of how disproportionate the impact of poverty is in these communities and populations, and allows for some opportunities to explore as to how and why this may be happening. Now, the reason that I'm able to do this is because at the moment I'm the custodian of a mandate that I understand is a patrimony of humankind. So I have it for a few years, but hopefully it's a mandate that will continue until violence and discrimination are effectively eradicated. And this mandate was created quite recently. It was created in 2016. And it was the result of the work of a large coalition of organizations of civil society working together to make it happen and to create a position that would have the possibility of reporting to the Human Rights Council in Geneva and to the General Assembly in New York on the status of violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and to identify what are good practices in terms of leading to eradication of violence and discrimination. The work, of course, was initiated and led by civil society. I think it was a coalition of over 1,000 organizations that worked from over 150 countries to make the mandate happen. But of course, to make it happen, there was also a need for a coalition of states that would be supporting it. However, the creation of the mandate was profoundly contentious. For the first time in history, it's a mandate that required 5 votes across the Human Rights Council in Geneva and 3 committees of the General Assembly of the UN. And the basic element of contention in relation to this was the fact that there was a large bloc of states, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the Community of Independent States, that actually submitted that this mandate was answering to a political agenda created in the global north and in the west, and that it actually was reflective of problems that do not exist in their jurisdictions. And this was done in the context, I don't know how many of you will have known this information, where the Minister of Justice of Russia famously said at the Universal Periodic Review, "We do not have gays in Chechnya, we have looked for them, they're nowhere to be found." So the idea is that this large community, this large group of states advanced the notion that this is not a reality in their jurisdictions and that these are foreign identities that are being inserted into their contexts. And we will talk a little bit about that. I find that this is one of the most powerful narratives that drives discrimination, is the notion that gays and lesbians and bisexual trans persons are not good citizens, that somehow their existence is immoral and contrary to good values. And I'll mention to you a little bit about that. The mandate, in my view, has 2 fundamental duties. One of them is to provide visibility to violence and discrimination. So whenever I prepare a report, my job is to try and understand how is it that discrimination manifests itself and what information do we have about the way that it happens all around the world. The other part, where I believe my job is very much focused, is I need to identify good practice and provide advice to states. My business is the business of state responsibility. I place it in a larger context, but the most important thing that I do is try to advise states on how to eradicate violence and discrimination. In order to do that, I need to talk, of course, with states, and for the longest that this mandate has been in operation, the principle has been anybody who wants to talk to the mandate holder can talk to the mandate holder, and any state can approach. I was delighted when the mandate was up for renewal this June to find out that that very, very divisive rhetoric had in fact calmed down. And so in June of this year, the mandate was renewed. And rather than having that situation of 5 votes across different venues and a rupture in the world into great blocs, we actually saw the African states abstain rather than vote against the country, and a very, very small coalition of states actually adverse the mandate, in total 12 out of 46. So a clear minority. States in that minority were Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Russia, countries in which issues such as criminalization are very, very pronounced and that continue maintaining that sexual orientation and gender identity and diversity within them, it's a foreign concept. When I took I wasn't the first mandate holder. My predecessor was Professor Vitit Muntaphorn from Thailand, a very, very eminent and very, very good man. Unfortunately, he had to resign for health reasons, but he was the mandate holder for the first year. And he did a great favor to the mandate, which was that he established a thematic agenda. And what he did was he decided that the research for the first 3 years of what he expected to be his time at the mandate, was going to be focused around 6 great themes. Criminalization of sexual orientation and gender identity, legal recognition of gender identity, social inclusion, and then, in a way of mirroring those elements, anti-discrimination legislation and measures, pathologization as a way to perpetuate violence and discrimination, and the creation of empathy through education. He was able to do the first two reports, and then when he had to step down, I took that framework and I examined it, and I thought that it was actually quite good framework, and I decided to continue it. This report that I'm about to present at the General Assembly is the last in that series. And in my view, what has been very exciting is that what we have been tasked with is to actually provide the conceptual basis of the mandate. So Professor Muntaphorn created this, what he called them underpinnings. And what you will, as persons that are coming to a faculty of law, appreciate is that he combined very strongly a very strong legal foundation within international human rights law, particularly with the reference of anti-discrimination legislation and criminalization, but he combined this with a wider picture of where is it that these processes take place. And he inserted that within society. And so the last report in that series is the report on social inclusion. And as you may imagine, this report shows that in all corners of the world, LGBT people continue to be subject to violence and discrimination. They continue to be excluded and marginalized. Now, violence and discrimination are perpetrated in a wide variety of contexts. They are perpetrated in the most domestic and intimate of contexts, but they're also perpetrated in public space and public discourse. So political campaigns, parliamentary debates, public manifestations, the most public of all discourses and the most public of all spaces, you actually will find that they reveal prejudice and misconception about the nature and the moral character of lesbian, gay, trans, bisexual, and gender diverse persons. What is unsettling, of course, about that is not only that these notions would be pervasive, but that they have shown to be, in some contexts, politically very profitable. I have stopped counting how many campaigns are waged on the idea of same-sex marriage or legal recognition of gender identity. Presidential campaigns in countries that have horrendous social and violence and public security problematics, and yet you see that the only issue that is being discussed in political campaign is whether people can marry persons of the same sex. There is something in sexual orientation and gender identity that captures people's imagination for the good and bad. There is something that reaches to the deepest fears and emotions of people, and that something is actually used by political actors to exploit and to create political profit. We're also seeing the rise of ultra-conservative, ultra-nationalist groups reclaiming so-called identities at the expense of sexual and gender minorities. They will challenge advances and prevent the development of laws and policies inclusive of LGBT people. And LGBT issues, as I said, are often instrumentalized also by religious leaders as a threat to national cohesion, culture, and tradition, in particular in periods of political and socioeconomic instability. There is a process of othering LGBT people. The idea of establishing that they are somehow not belonging lies at the root of these very processes. A woman in Ukraine once told me that the most pervasive narrative that she faced since she came out as a lesbian was the fact that she would not bear children for the country and for the homeland, and that she would be in part responsible for the depletion of the country of the Ukrainian nationality and the fall of the country to coming hordes of persons that would then eliminate the real nationality of the country. Modulate that statement, and it's not that different from any other part in the world where this is actually said. Modulate that statement and you will actually find that the idea that lesbian women who adopt children are somehow selfish is pervasive in the discourse. A week and a half ago, in a public parade in France, where the object of concern of the movement towards family was the 2,000 children being adopted every year by lesbian women, rather than the tens of thousands that are in situations of poverty, for example. So these dialogues are pervasive in a way that it's actually quite worrisome to me. All these impacts on the social inclusion of LGBT individuals has a consequence. It has the consequence that there are systemic barriers that are then created to access to whole sectors of not only state services, but whole sectors that are necessary for development and basically for the pursuit of happiness. So when you look at the situation of absolute rupture between trans women and the health system, it is not very surprising that in some parts of the world their life expectancy is of 35 years. Let that sink in for a second. Imagine that a trans woman in Latin America, when reaching 25 years old, is already entering her old age. This is due to systemic factors. Trans women are vilified when coming to hospitals. Personnel is absolutely inadequate, unqualified to actually understand their needs. They will probably be called out loud. I've received many testimonies of persons that are made wait for hours in the waiting rooms, and then they will be called by their legal name rather than their adopted or real name. But this is not only happening in health, it happens in education, housing, employment, political participation, and personal security, and freedom from violence. My findings come back and time again to one single fact. There's a number of structural processes that have been put in place in societies all around the world throughout decades, sometimes hundreds of years, in societies to perpetuate the notion that certain genital configurations determine a certain role in society. And that these certain genital configurations must guide and determine who you love, who you desire, who you feel attraction to. And this primal ordering principle has been instrumentalized through a series of mechanisms that I have come to qualify as negation and stigma. Negation, very obviously, the idea that gay people don't exist, that they're a transplant, that it's a fad. And stigma translated into processes that I call demonization, criminalization, and pathologization. Sin, crime, and illness. The great proportion of violence and discrimination perpetrated every day around the world has, in my view, a connection to one or several of these mechanisms which have been in operation for centuries and that have carved deep grooves in the collective consciousness of peoples everywhere. So, for example, at school, LGBT pupils face abuse, physical violence, social isolation, humiliation, and death threats. This leads to unsafety, missed school days, and reduced chances of academic success. In educational settings, LGBT youth are more likely to commit suicide than others. In the Netherlands, for example, a recent study showed that the risk of suicide is 4 times higher among LGBT pupils compared with others. The response of schools is often poor, by intent or by negligence. Schools, administrators, and teachers are often ill-equipped to address bullying and discrimination and fearful that parents and social groups will attack them if they work on issues related to sexual orientation and gender identity. A minister of education a few months ago, we were having a conversation about why it was difficult to aim towards comprehensive sex education. And what he let me know is that his predecessor had attempted to do so, only 2 weeks later to see himself fired because of political action by parents. He was not going to make the same mistake. He understood the difficulties of the matter. In the field of employment, LGBT persons face discrimination and abuse in all regions, all stages, hiring, advancement, training, compensation, and termination, and in the implementation of benefits throughout. The most used tactic is to conceal one's sexual orientation and gender identity, but we also know now that that leads to considerable anxiety, and this is not because this is the most important thing, but it also leads to decreased productivity. So even if one takes the economic argument, which in my view is not the most important one, it's actually something that doesn't make sense. Other areas are not that evident to everyone. LGBT people face discrimination in access to housing as a result to unfair treatment by public and private landlords, state agencies, and credit providers who deny leases and mortgages. I have testimony of same-sex couples being harassed by neighbors and evicted from their homes. A survey in Sri Lanka recently showed that 24% of LGBT respondents had been unable to rent housing or had been forced to change their domiciles. In addition, exclusion from homes and communities lead to disproportionate representation of LGBT people within the homeless population. I was mentioning about that at the beginning of this talk. But where data exists, and it's not in very many places, the data cuts across the board. There's no doubt LGBT people are disproportionately reflected in the homeless population. What is worse is that when accessing shelters, LGBT people will face enormous challenges. For example, trans persons are very often turned away from shelters in the idea that is associated, without any kind of evidence, with the idea that trans women are predatory in nature, that they are sexual predators. And so shelters oftentimes have the policy of turning them away because that actually creates an impact on the safety of women that are living in the same shelter. Health disparities, I was mentioning them a little bit before. I'm not going to actually dwell too much on that, but the data that is shown in the report is actually quite concerning in macro levels. For example, one of the things that I have begun to realize throughout this research is that not you and not me, because we're not of the same generation. We and the people that are my age are the same generation that will have to come to an understanding of what structures need to be put in place to deal with the problematic of aging LGBT persons. And we are the first generations that actually are needing to understand what is the long-term impact of the use of antiretrovirals, for example, or long-term impact of stress that people have faced over lives where coming out of the closet was a factor creating significant insecurity and risk of violence. All of these factors, and also the disproportionate prevalence of HIV/AIDS, I now know, after my research, that they are indeed pronounced predictors of cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's, for example. So what we're going to start seeing is that the impact of decades of health disparities and condition disparities is also going to be impacting the situation of aging LGBT persons that are now finding themselves not only suffering those impacts, but also going back to communities and retirement places and healthcare settings and assisted living settings that are actually not equipped to receive them. And so one of the most heartbreaking things that I found in my research, well, everything is heartbreaking. I don't want to minimize, but one that was unsuspected to me was the plight of people that are actually going back into the closet in their old age after having gone through the process of coming out, because now, in order to protect themselves from violence in healthcare settings, they're actually coming back to the closet. And one of the testimonies that was really touching to me in that relation was one where the person knew that because of family history, he would have a proclivity to Alzheimer's, and was horrified of the fact that his own inability to control his own disclosures may actually place him in a situation of great risk. And this is something that, again, we tend to not have visible before us. This touches upon one of the concepts that I think is quite fundamental to my mandate, is I work within intersectionality. Nobody is defined solely for the fact of being gay or lesbian or trans. Everybody, an activist from Kenya once told me, we embody many identities in one body. We keep many identities in one body. And the idea is, of course, there are strong intersections between LGBTI issues and those of aging persons. But one that organizations of persons that are aging came very, very strongly through is the fact of constant invisibilization by society. And so that is actually quite, I'm sorry, you with the headphones, I'm so sorry that I'm doing that. I know that it must be like I'm scratching the board. Of course, once one finds the problematic, there's a wonderful Uruguayan writer that said, well, you've given me enough of the problematic, how about giving me some of the solutionatic? It doesn't exist in Spanish either, the word, just so you know, but it was a nice concept. And so my job is to actually try and find what the problem is and then try to see what it is that works. And so this report benefited from inputs of several dozen states that presented submission, and then hundreds of organizations of civil society that were presenting information about what works. So in my findings, I have tried to classify and to send a message to states that there are certain things that they need to put in place if they want to have successful social inclusion and to address discrimination. The first thing is there needs to be an acknowledgement that LGBT persons make a meaningful contribution to society. That they are good citizens, and some of them are bad citizens, just like everybody else. But that by and large, they are good citizens, they work, they pay their taxes, they contribute to society, and they are weaving every day the fabrics of the threads of this social fabric. Second, it is important that there is a political acknowledgement that the aspiration of LGBT persons to find themselves and to live free and equal, to live openly, it's an expression of their exercise of human rights. That needs to be acknowledged. It cannot be that this is a question to be done secretly, belonging to the realm of the most obscure part of your bedroom. Being politically active with your identity is an expression of human rights. Being able to have sexual orientation and gender identity be also a political identity is an important part of the exercise of human rights. And with this, we are now entering in what I think is in the works of the great ruling of the Supreme Court of India, or the ruling of the court in Botswana, or in Trinidad and Tobago. We're entering a new age of understanding of what this is in an expression of rights. And it's the fact that the idea of living free and equal is not one that belongs only to the concept of privacy, as was ruled by the Human Rights Committee in 1991 in the Toonen case of Australia. The logic then was, it is your privacy, you do what you want in your bedroom, that I should not come in there and actually take a look at that. But the reality of matters is that that is the point where a great, great dissonance was created with the feminist thinking. One activist said to me once, feminist thinkers have been asking the state to come into the bedroom to address domestic violence for decades, and now the LGBTI movement is asking the state to stay out. And that has been one of the great dissonances in legal discourse of these movements for the last 25 years. In my view now, all of these judicial rulings are coming together to say, no, this is a part of human dignity. And it is something that needs to be done in public space. It is something that needs to be politically expressed in public space. And of course, sexual activity is one thing, but sexual orientation in a persona is something that is very different. In my view, the third element that needs to be put in place is that the satisfaction of these human rights, it's also the key to unleashing the full potential of LGBT people and their full contribution to society. Is the key to ensure that people are going to be less anxious, are going to be able to share with their co-workers and with the people in their schools, are able to share the full scope of their persona. Once that is in place, There are other things that are quite evident to me. The first one is the dismantling of legislation that criminalizes sexual orientation and gender identity or expression. 69 countries, as of today, continue criminalizing sexual orientation, with penalties that range from fines in the least of the cases to death penalty in 10 countries, effectively enforced in 6 countries due to sexual orientation in particular. Those 69 countries mean that around 2 billion persons of the world population live in criminalized environments. Now, as you know, probably, we don't know exactly what is the prevalence of LGBT people in society, and part of that is that it's very difficult to get data precisely because of criminalized environments and other factors. But I work always with an assumption that it must be somewhere between 5 and 10%. So if you're looking at that figure of 2 billion people living in criminalized environment, I'm not good at math. Is that 200 million? Yeah, 100 to 200 million persons that are at this moment made criminals in the states in which they are born and reside, simply because of the fact of who they are. And I think that that is, of course, something that is quite worrisome. Once that is in place, the other element is there is a value to robust systems of anti-discrimination legislation. It is very much discussed whether people are protected enough with legislation that actually says that people cannot be persecuted on the basis of sex. Unluckily for the LGBT community, but luckily for the example that I'm about to give you, there seems to be contention about that fact, and that is right now very much before the Supreme Court of the United States. So that example should actually be quite simple to prove the point that it's not completely understood as a uniform concept that sexual orientation is included in the concept of sex. This has been solved at the international human rights level by the Human Rights Committee since Tunen, when it was determined that sexual orientation is a part of the whole concept of non-discrimination, in part because of allusions to sex and other factors. And then the idea is that states are in the possibility of reviewing their public policy to promote measures of inclusion. And those are very varied in nature, and since this talk is going to be so completely enticing to you, I know that all of you are going to run out and read the report in full, all 10,700 words of it, which is the maximum that UN allows. But it is. They cut the number 10,701, they will put it out, whatever word it is. And so you need to kind of deliver that. But anyhow, the point of the matter is, I'm not going to go into all of those, but there's a couple of things that I would like to mention quite quickly in wrapping up. The first one is that all measures have one element in common, and that is that they have the participation of the communities that are involved. There's a great mantra of the female movement, of feminist thinking, which is nothing about us without us, and I think that this is fully applicable also for work in relation to LGBT issues. And this, of course, requires enormous effort because some of these communities and populations have been excluded normally from political discourse and from public space. So, for example, when you have a situation in trans communities that are, thrown out of home when they are between 9 and 12, they are kicked out of school by the time that they are also 9 and 12. They will very often have worked all of their short lives in the informal sector. How do you actually make sure to bring those persons into public discourse? Well, the duty of state is to speak in the language, to create the narrative, create the spaces so that these persons can be their own experts in their own lived experiences in their own terms. And to me, that is part of what is an absolute necessity when it comes to designing these measures. The scope of measures then is actually quite extraordinary. What I was able to find was measures that related to very, very specific and overarching policies in the very formalized sectors of employment and education and health, with very, very state-minded views, particularly in European states where social welfare state still is vigorous and maintained. But in other cases, there are fantastic examples of measures of social inclusion that are just inventive and fun. So for example, inclusion in sport is one of the elements that I found creates enormous drive for social change. All of you are aware of the effect of using the public space. So the ability of people to carry out pride parades and the way that this exposure is creating social change is actually quite important. For me, the use of public space is one of the factors that is most important in democracy, and therefore it bears a direct connection with democratic participation. What will happen on Thursday is that I will present this report. I won't have as much time. You probably are saying you didn't have that much time now, but you took it anyway. I will present my report, and there will be hopefully questions by states. It is usually a highly scripted exercise. But what I'm hoping is that more and more I will be able to develop with states a conversation about how they're using these reports. Because of course the panic of an independent expert or a special rapporteur is that you put all of this effort, and civil society and states put all of this effort, and then this goes and gets shelved and gathers dust, right? So my hope is that I will be able to take this forward, and also that I will be able to take it forward in the design of the research agenda that I will be undertaking for the next 3 years, and of which, of course, the human rights program is going to be a very important part, given that I will be here until December of 2020. My hope is that now I could get some feedback from you. Very much welcoming questions, comments, constructive criticism. And already now I thank you for your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming to speak with us. My name is Danny. I'm a 1L at the law school. My question is regarding, you talked about at the beginning how you identified some of the best practices among states. Could you talk about a few practices that have stuck out to you regarding how states enter LGBTQ issues into dialogue with religious factions?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's a fantastically important issue. Health-based organizations and institutionalities, because they can be very different, are a huge factor. And I have so far done 3 country visits, and in each one I have found that faith-based organizations can play an incredibly constructive role, but also a very destructive narrative in relation to inclusion and exclusion. So I'll just mention 2 findings, and then I'll go to the crux of your question, which is about practices. The first finding is that, by the way, I always talk with religious leaders, and I'm very proud that in every country that I have gone, I have seen and talked with every religious denomination that was reflective of a critical mass within society. So in Georgia, I was very proud to be received by the Orthodoxy in Georgia, and we had a long meeting discussing challenges and perceptions. In some cases, we were not in agreement, but trying to develop that dialogue. To me, the most important factor in those concerns is to take point of departure in an understanding as to whether the religion has at its base an understanding that violence and discrimination cannot be justified on any grounds, and that includes sexual orientation and gender identity. And so far I haven't found anybody that has told me that they believe so. But of course then the question is, how does it get practiced? And my question to these religious leaders has been, okay, well that's the major part of the statement, but when your priests are in the pulpit inciting to violence on the day of a pride march, for example, what are the processes that you have put in place to actually create accountabilities in relation to this issue? And the answer has always been, there's no process, there's no accountability. So the reality is that that statement of saying that violence and discrimination are not acceptable, though is not fundamented by good measures of implementation in practice. I think that there are three things that are very interestingly happening. I'll give you an example from another country visit. I was just in Iceland a few weeks ago, and speaking with the bishop, who's also at the moment the rotating chair of the Interfaith Working Group. The state, without interfering, in Iceland, the church is a church of state. So what the state did is it actually promoted the creation of an interfaith dialogue in relation to these issues, and an understanding that while there is not a conversation from a theological perspective, because there, of course, there might be very different points of view, there is an understanding about what the limits of discourse in churches can be. And those are, of course, hate speech, for example, is one limit. And so there was vigorous discussion, and I would say, perhaps this is not a term that they would enjoy, but training in relation to what that limit would be, and to which members of different faith-based groups would be held accountable if they incurred in that. And I think this was a process that has been going on for 25 years. You may say, oh, it's Iceland. No, 25 years ago, these were real issues being discussed, and each and time again, they come back into the fore. Interestingly enough, for example, they go on to discuss things that for me were unsuspected, such as an intended prohibition for male circumcision, for example, was discussed at this forum as a more recent thing, perhaps more modern in Icelandic terms. So that's the first thing. And I've seen that happen in several countries that are not in which the process is not as forward. So for example, in several countries in Latin America, there's interfaith fora where the state is actually requesting that each once in a while the LGBT commissioner or the National Human Rights Institution come and develop a dialogue. That to me is key. And again, it's key that it gets developed as a conversation, but also as a question of limits, because there are some limits that will be created. There are certain supra processes that are to me very important and interesting, and that relate, for example, to international narratives in relation to religious groups. So, for example, when you hear that in Uganda there are movements to reintroduce the death penalty, and that it is a matter of public record that this is being fueled by certain sympathizers of certain faith denominations, I think that there should be mechanisms of accountability in relation to that as well. And that's part of what I'm trying to work and understand. Finally, at international level, there is a coalition that I find admirable and that I work a lot with. It's called the Global Interfaith Network, GINSOGI. And it's a coalition of 800 religious denominations that are working from the point of view of inclusion and respect of sexual orientation. And they are creating a vigorous movement internationally. And I think that this is also, then you have the local level and you have the international level. But for me, the key is limits to which also representatives of the church are to be held accountable. That to me is the very, very best.
Victor, thank you so much. Victor, thank you so much for your talk. Incredibly insightful, and I learned so much. Thank you. I'm curious, when you're at the UN and you're speaking to these states, some of whom say we don't have anybody who's LGBTQ, is then the matter for you one of persuasion? I mean, what then becomes your role? That's all I have. Thanks.
Well, hopefully my role will be more and more the one that can actually undertake a courteous, respectful, but also well-informed dialogue about what data is telling us. Having received testimony of many persons coming from countries in which there is negation, I have that with me as an arsenal. I can actually, I've been very, very often in situations where I can look people in the eyes and say, I have received testimony of persons, and I know that this is absolutely not the case. I believe it because of everything that I know, but I also just happen to have the empirical evidence that this is not true. I think that in my view, and I'm on record saying this, the absolute negation is, although it still happens in more places than what I would like to know, is less and less a discourse that anybody can keep a straight face to. And people don't like to look foolish in general. And so I think that it will be less so. But what is very common for me, and I put this in one of my reports, is that a state agent will come and tell me, you know, Victor, you're working on this and there's only 300 gays in this country. You know, they're the ones in that organization, and I have lived 30 years in my neighborhood and I have never seen one gay. You know, and it's exactly the way that it's said, you know, and then you realize that it's and in that case, it is very much a question of persuasion and presenting evidence and trying to tap into people without, you know, the temptation would be to then become really, you know, sarcastic and ironic. But the reality is that to some degree there's a sincerity in believing that, because in some contexts the invisibility is so well enforced that it's almost a betrayal of that social pact to accept that it is not the case. But this was said to me in a country that had 40 million people. Huh? The one about 300? I mean, and the thing is, you're laughing, and that's precisely what I wanted to do, but I have to keep a straight face and, you know, say, I'm not sure that that's the case. But we'll see. I'll take you out on a Friday night and show you. You know what I mean?
Hello, Victor. My name is Chris DeMayo. I'm a member of the local Arlington Human Rights Commission. You may be aware of a joint consortium of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, United Church of Christ, and the Quakers here locally and across the United States, assisting asylum seekers escaping from African nations, especially Uganda, LGBTQ persons who are escaping oppression and violence and criminalization. You mentioned Uganda briefly. Would you talk a little bit more about your observations in Africa and what is mentioned in your report?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, immediately then we know that we're talking about a continent that has such diversity in itself that very few things will be valid all across the board. So one of the things that I'm very keen on doing is to be able to explore a bit more different contexts. But I have worked a lot in Africa even before I was the independent expert, and so I'm able to kind of draw some things from my experience. It's a combination of things. I think that there's a great challenge of criminalization in Africa, and even when by and large processes are going in the direction that I perceive as correct, dismantling criminalization, the resurgence of that political narrative in countries like Uganda and Tanzania worries me very much. In both cases, I have engaged the states to some formality to try and understand what it is that is fueling this. And as a matter of fact, each and every resurgence has to do in some way or another with a context of political processes. So it is very important for me to understand exactly how that factor plays. So criminalization is a big challenge. I think that is one of the many contexts where it is found to be having a political profit to actually raise the issue of criminalization. And I don't know how many of you are aware, one of the issues that I engaged Tanzania a couple of years ago was relating to the raids of gay persons and the threat of performing coercive anal examinations, which are, in my view, a form of torture and which have zero value from any perspective other than making people suffer. So there you have that element. What is very interesting in Africa, and what I do a lot of dialogue with local leaders, is the fact that this is a result of colonization. And yet, the political narrative is that now this idea of respect is being brought in as an imposition, but it's not seen that there's great inconsistency with the fact that criminalizing and structures of stigma were the result of colonization. And So I think that that's quite complex, and it necessitates a lot of dialogue. Mozambique is my country visit that I have done in Africa so far, and there is where I drew a lot of these observations about a social contract. Mozambique has a very interesting situation where there are problems of violence, but by and large there is consensus on the fact that there is not a problem of people being killed or suffering extreme forms of torture or beatings, for example, for being LGBT. But what there is an absolute situation where then the social contract is that you cannot, by any standard, be having a political identity as LGBT. You will need to suppress that completely, and the social pact is closet for everyone. And that, of course, is very complicated in that connection. North of Africa is a very different situation. You have different criminalizing structures and different kind of I say societal meta-discourses. And in Western Africa, I think is a different situation. Particularly, one of the concerns that I have actually engaged states with is conversion therapy. That's part of what I have been able to observe in Western Africa, and I have concerns about that. Conversion therapy, by the way, is the topic of my next report. And I will be doing a call for inputs very soon. And that is a report, the research of which is actually being carried out very much here. So I'm hoping to come back at some stage, not here, but to the virtual idea of coming back to all of you with letting you know what I found in relation to that.
Now, unlawful in Massachusetts, we are proud to tell you.
Yes. Yes. And what I'm hoping to do in my reports is I'm trying to tap into the evidence bases that motivate that type of bans, because the legal questions that I'm exploring is whether conversion therapy is per se fitting within definition of torture and cruel and inhuman degrading treatment, or whether there's a threshold to be crossed in relation to that. And I think interrogating those evidence bases is going to be quite interesting and important for that.
Thank you, Victor. I have somewhat of a follow-up question. So my work previously has been in Haiti, where this narrative that you referenced of people who are supporting LGBTQ rights, that this is really something that's coming from abroad and is being imposed on other countries. And in that context, we really struggled with how to effectively do international advocacy in solidarity with LGBTQ communities. In particular, because affected communities themselves were telling us that they had a fear that our engagement would actually be counterproductive. And so I'm curious how you have navigated this in your role as an actor coming from the outside, trying to engage with this, and also if you have recommendations for civil society groups who are looking to provide support in this type of context.
100%. So this was very, very, very clear to me when the Tanzania problem occurred, the persecution, and civil society in Tanzania was deeply divided. And a sector of it was saying, please don't come because this will just create a not to me. I'll just mention, they were saying to the international community, please don't come because on this issue, because it will create huge backlash and it will exacerbate violence against us. And by the way, they also said, please do not impose sanctions, economic sanctions, because then the rest of civil society is actually going to look against us and say, and this will create a backlash. So these are very delicate processes. My guiding principle is always I listen very closely to the people on the ground, to the people that are there, in the first line of defense, human rights defenders. That's pretty much what should give the guiding. But of course, sometimes it's a judgment call because sometimes civil society is deeply divided themselves, and they are creating kind of a different narrative, which is logical and normal, but then you need to be very careful. To me, I'm yet to see any example where the international actors listened keenly to the local activists and were wrong. Frankly, I've never seen a situation where if the local activists were the one determining what the agenda should be, I've never seen an example where it has gone wrong. Whereas I have plenty where the international community has come in with predetermined models and it's been a disaster. So to me, that is the very obvious thing, which is, of course, you exactly mentioned it. It's what you were doing, and it's the only thing. In my case, I have an advantage, which is that I can validly claim in discourse and in practice that I can't come in because the state wants me to. And so it's a lot less powerful, the narrative, to say that I am an imposition from abroad. And because, you know, my messaging is always, I'm here because the states, the community of states have asked me to engage. But of course, at some point, if the narrative is that anybody who's catching a plane to go and dealing with the issue, then of course I'm within that as well. Yeah, and the other thing that I was just hoping to mention quite quickly is that situations change very fast. In this issue, you may have a context of absolute support, and then one election will change it all. And so that's the other thing. It needs to be that whoever goes in needs to know that it's a long-term investment and that you cannot just stick to an approach. That's not only in the global south, huh? It's in the global north as well. In this topic, you can actually have the situation where one election will just change everything in terms of the public policy. And so I think it's important to have that possibility. And you had a question.
It was very similar.
Oh, okay. Right.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My name's Harry, I'm a 1L here. I want to ask you, for those of us who are interested in making a difference in these issues, who are perhaps interested in making a career out of being involved in international LGBT rights advocacy, what kinds of things would you suggest for us to get involved with? What are some ways you think would be a good way to sort of get an introduction to the topic?
It's a difficult question because it actually depends. I'll give you a formulaic caveat, and then I'll answer your question. Don't worry, I will answer. But just the caveat that I need to say is I really do believe that it's very much related to the perception that one has about where you can do more impact. So some people go on to having wonderful careers within state structures. There's a whole new generation of persons that are working in national human rights institutions, as presidential commissioners on LGBTI issues, and they are the ones driving the change because they are dealing with the state from within state structures. And then other people are more suited to civil society and the nature of activism. I started working very early on as an international civil servant, so I've always been working at international courts and regional bodies, and that's where I have my toolbox. Having said that, what I would say is very simple, and I'm coming of the age where I can impart wise advice, so I will allow myself to do it, is you really need to enjoy it. It really needs to be something that you enjoy, because when choosing what you do with every day and perhaps determining what you're going to be doing for a very long time, what you need to know is that you need to enjoy it very much, and that's my great privilege, that I enjoy what I do. So if that's what you follow, I don't think that you can go wrong, but of course that's very generic. So I know that I disappoint you.
On that note, I'd like to thank Victor Madrigal-Borloz again for joining us here today. And as he mentioned, he is in residence here until the end of next year. So you'll have plenty more opportunities to meet with him and to hear about his work. So if you could join me in thanking him.
Thank you.